Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 10th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Base. The text follows. An ingenious author tried to concentrate in a single conception, that of a base, a whole host of objects among which sundry relations, even with immaterial forces, found their way in as well. The list comprised the subsistence of the troops, the keeping them complete in numbers and equipment, the security of communications with the home country, lastly, the security of retreat in case it became necessary. And first of all, he proposed to substitute this conception of a base for all these things. Then, for the base itself to substitute its own length, extent, and last of all to substitute the angle formed by the army with this base. All this was done to obtain a pure geometrical result, utterly useless. This last is in fact unavoidable, if we reflect that none of these substitutions could be made without violating truth and leaving out some of the things contained in the original conception. The idea of a base is a real necessity for strategy, and to have conceived it is meritorious, but to make such a use of it as we have depicted is completely inadmissible, and could not but lead to partial conclusions, which have forced these theorists into a direction opposed to common sense, namely to a belief in the decisive effect of the enveloping form of attack. So this is a kind of a bizarre paragraph that actually is very interesting and important, not much because of, in fact, what von Clausewitz puts the terms like, but for the matter of discussion, because here the author is criticizing the intuitions, the theories of Adam Heinrich Dietrich Baron von Bülow, that was a Prussian soldier, a military theorist, who incidentally was teaching at the Berlin Institute between 1801-1804, when Lieutenant von Clausewitz was a student at the time. And this is a kind of a strange figure, because he basically attempted to popularize the fighting style of the French armies of the early revolutionary era, and who had an impact, actually, as we will see also from the following paragraph here in the Vom Kriege, on the military critic Antoine-Henri de Jomini, that, as you know, was the major, let's say, rival of von Clausewitz, that, however, recognized his genius in the end. Unfortunately, when von Clausewitz was already dead, but he was a man of great intelligence, and he realized von Clausewitz's genius, and he publicly revealed this. And this is very important because it has to do, as we will see now, with certain geometrical principles in the approach of warfare, right, that von Clausewitz rejects fully by demonstrating their futility, basically. And von Bülow was kind of a strange character. Eventually he was imprisoned and sentenced. He did if I'm not wrong, he died, however, in captivity, if I remember correctly, as he was essentially criticizing the old way of warfare. I mean, you must give him the intuition of certain important principles in this work of his, that is his Geist des neueren Kriegssystems, right? So this is written in 1799, the spirit of the new systems of warfare. He had fought himself, and though with some but it's not important now. The point, though, is understanding here the ferments that existed in the Prussian military debate, let's say, at the military level proper, that were involving the sense that something had to change. Von Bülow was fascinated with the French revolutionary armies, their tactics, the columns, something we will talk about one day. But as von Clausewitz shows here, he went astray from trying to make a synthesis that was essentially based initially with some kind of effort in intelligence, because von Clausewitz defines here as an ingenious author, someone who had a kind of a critical intellect. in as we'll see now, to reduce the art, the theory of the art of war into a merely geometrical fashion that cannot serve in any way. Especially in this case, not that geometry has nothing to do with the way war is fought. Space has its own importance, and the concept of interior lines that was expressed by Jomini naturally also was meaningful in some regard, but limited to a sphere of knowledge that is not really what you need at the moment of the fight, aside from certain basic principles that you can apply scientifically in this sense, but that not necessarily are going to make by themselves the decisive difference, and can be in this sense misleading at the end of practical warfare. So von Clausewitz in this paragraph was continuing in its historical review. So basically he arrives to von Bülow in this. We arrived in the 18th century. Realized from the previous paragraphs that we arrived at this point in which certain more complex theories, also due to the development, of course, of the contemporary warfare, were taking care of other factors rather than simply numerical ones, etc. And so von Bülow takes the next step by trying to concentrate in a single conception, as von Clausewitz writing here, the one of base, a whole host of objects amongst which sundry relations even with immaterial forces found their way in as well. And so here the author was attempting a synthesis, right? Von Bülow was attempting a synthesis of several elements we will see now, that von Clausewitz says had the merit of considering also immaterial aspects. We have seen in the previous paragraphs how the theory of the art of war had been limited up to that point roughly to material objects. Right here there are also moral forces that are conceived overall, and that therefore make von Bülow some appearing get a better, of course, as taking a further step to certain other principles. And here von Clausewitz lists what von Bülow was talking about specifically, what elements constituted his synthesis, and the list here comprises the subsistence of the troops, and keeping them complete in numbers and equipment, the security of communications with the home country, lastly the security of retreat in case it became necessary. So all elements that have to do fundamentally with keeping your army together in an operational fashion that has a substantial emphasis posed on this material side, of course, in terms of keeping the army supplied, but also maintaining it by controlling the supply lines, the communications with the home countries, says, and making it possible for the army to retreat eventually to it. So already this aspect is kind of sparks some perplexity, because we've seen that basically the whole 18th century warfare had been based, especially in the last acquisitions of Prussian military theory, was about essentially outflanking the enemy army in order to cut its supply lines, right? And think about the 7 Years' War. It was fought all seemingly in this fashion in between Prussia and Austria, because armies were considerably large, and therefore this material aspect of course keeping them connected with the center with the home country where the resources at least were coming from, the supplies were coming from, was conceived, and it still is extremely important. But once again, what's the point in the application? I mean, it's obvious at that point that the enemy is always going to outflank you. So here, I admit I haven't never read von Bülow, so I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but we can trust von Clausewitz relatively to certain... I've actually searched this evening for something about that, and literally von Bülow writes what von Clausewitz is writing here, which is even more perplexing, because I mean, not that I distrusted von Clausewitz, but what the hell, man? Von Bülow really went straight from reason. In fact, he was considered crazy at one point, as far as I know, and I was in prison, but also because he had written a kind of satirical work on the campaign of 1805 and other aspects. So we're, as we were saying before, we don't enter here into details of von Bülow, say, a personal life, but here we criticize the thinking in itself. So what is interesting here is the concept of base, right, that has somewhat to ensure all of these elements. Here, even without knowing exactly what von Bülow wrote, I suggest that this was really the concept of base as we mean it, like the base from which the army operated from the field. So I think it could, it had to do with really not necessarily just the camp in itself, but wherever the army was based on for its operations, where it had, I suppose, to revert while he was out there to fight the enemy, right? Eventually. So the concept here assumes already a relatively vague character. Like, I didn't find any other information regarding this concept of base. It's just the base of the operation. So it can mean at this point literally everything, meaning that, whether you talk about a squad or an entire division, you have to identify this base of operation that does exist, because objectively, that's where armies operate from. But here it's when it gets weird, and von Clausewitz tells us why. Because going on with von Bülow's conception, it says, and first of all, he proposed to substitute this conception of a base for all these things. So if you understand correctly, von Bülow was proposing to let's say, to substitute this conception of base for all of these things put together, meaning not individually, but let's say of a base that could ensure all of these factors combined, like the subsistence of the troops, the keeping them complete in numbers and equipment, the security of communications with the own country, and the security of retreat in case it became necessary, right? Which just kind of makes sense, because a camp, the base of operation, is fundamentally where your troops have supplies in store. They can't return to the night without dying out there, harassed by the enemies. Which is kind of a fortification. So maintaining their numbers, their equipment, and also representing this sort of avant-post from out of which there is the enemy, but it still maintains the direct communications with the home country, and that keeps open the way for eventually retreating to the home country in case things go wrong, right? So all in all, we don't have to think the von Bülow was weird in everything. These are sensible concepts. Even von Clausewitz praises them at one point. Then he says he substitutes this concept first of all with the concept of base, right? The idea that everything has to depend fundamentally on this base, where in another, right? Which is not really how things work, meaning that even the base is subject to some sort of danger, of instability. Like it's fixed, for example. It can move definitely if you decide to change base, to shift it somewhere else, but at the same time, like, an enemy army is faster than that. Or, it can be under the weather, it can suffer some in some other way. I mean, there are lots of things that can go wrong that have basically nothing to do with the theoretical order of the space the way it's described in here. And then von Clausewitz says that von Bülow substituted further the base itself with its own length, that is, its own extent. So here basically von Bülow didn't just think of a base meant like a point in the ground, right? Which makes sense. But he basically makes all these logical steps by reasoning on different dimensions that frankly have nothing to do with each other, right? He's basically stating, okay, a camp has its own extension. Let's assume it's a square, right? So you can measure its extent. It's a kind of a physical dimension. It has its own territorial extension. Fine, but then how does that tell us that somehow this concept of base is transforming now from a series of let's say of elements of object, let's say, that they should be contained in the concept of base in itself, that eventually is transformed in a sort of geometrical notion of a camp with a plant, and so on. And last of all, for Clausewitz, right, to substitute the angle formed by the army with this base. So what this means actually is the following: is that von Bülow was expressing that the success of a military operation depended largely on the angle formed by two lines running from the extreme ends of the base of the operations to the objective. In other words, just imagine you have a square, a camp, well, and imagine where the or a circle, whatever, but think about of its extremes, so its side or its diameter, depending on which shape you take, and measure and pinpoint outside of it the position of the objective of the military operation. Well, then trace, which is a point, so trace the two lines that from the object arrive to the camp and to the extremes of the extreme ends of the camp. So now you will have an angle, right? So von Bülow basically states that if the base of the operation was suitably placed and sufficiently extended for these two lines to converge on the target at an angle of 90 degrees or more, quote, victory was as certain as could reasonably be expected, right? So you will say, this guy was nuts. Apparently so. Meaning, what the hell does this even mean in the first place? So here, von Clausewitz rightfully adds, all this was done to obtain a pure geometrical result, utterly useless. I mean, there is not sensibly any explanation here that could serve. I mean, trying to if I understood this, I mean, this is really what von Bülow wrote, right? Here, von Clausewitz doesn't enter actually in the details. He doesn't even name von Bülow proper, but at his time, everybody knew what he was talking about. So he doesn't even enter into the demonstration of how this is absurd, but it's kind of self-evident. So this guy had objectively said that if the angle formed between the extreme ends of the camp and the enemy, fundamentally, or the objective, whatever, was larger than 90 degrees, it was from 90 degrees up, let's say, up to 180, because otherwise it would have become like, well, actually more, because in this sense, in fact, von Clausewitz concludes that there was this decisive effect, according to von Buch, of the enveloping form of an attack. So theoretically, this means that you could even create a base of operations that can envelop the enemy, right? So according to this theory, for example, every kind of siege would be successful because of, I don't know what, because you surrounded the enemy with your own camps. What's the point of the story? I mean, couldn't that enemy be overwhelmingly stronger and break the encirclement, and you're done for? But in that case of the encirclement, it's kind of even more, let's say, intuitive. If the angle is, let's say, between 180 and 90, what kind of situation is that exactly? Like the base of operation at 180 degrees, for example, can be just facing the enemy in all its in all the length, the objective in all the length of its own extent. How this becomes exactly a reason of superiority. Like it's face to face. The enemy could be stronger than you. The objective could be tougher than you. What's the point in here? Like here, if I understood correctly, the real problem with the concept is that it doesn't take into consideration the enemy forces in any way. Like it can't be. It's just a geometrical disposition that in reality is also kind of meaningless to achieve. For defeating an enemy at a distance, what does it mean exactly? I mean, here maybe it involves even the concept of proximity to the base of operations, because obviously given the geometrical principle, if you approach the base of operation to the enemy, the angle will increase in width, right? So that theoretically can go closer to 90 degrees or more. But doesn't mean, if you have a camp, you have to reach one enemy, and the terrain is completely messed up, and you have to go left and right and up and down, etc. And what does that tell you exactly on the on the success, for example, basing yourself on the angle that you create with the enemy? It doesn't make any sense, apparently. I mean, it's not even a I don't know even how to define this, right? It's completely sense. In fact, von Clausewitz states it's utterly useless. I mean, because everything was reduced to a pure geometrical result, right? There is nothing else in here. There is not any other consideration but literally an angle. An angle, if you prefer, sorry. An angle. How can war be reduced to an angle? Like the principle of interior lines in Yomini is very different. It has to do, for example, on how the lines of fire can intersect, and that's actually a real thing. Obviously, if you have a formation that makes an angle, you can get in that corner an enemy that gets way more fire than if it met the formation in a straight line. That is a concept that objectively does make some difference on the field, but that also by itself it's not the key to win battles, because you may not be able to be in that condition, or it might even be disadvantageous in certain senses, also because at that point you need also another let's say either you're covered, you have your flanks covered, otherwise you have to continue the line, you have to create another acute angle that is instead a very vulnerable place. That's why, in fact, when in square formation, grenadiers were placed internally on that angle to kind of prevent, for example, cavalry charges, etc. So that's the principle of interior lines that made some sense, and that Yomini, von Clausewitz estimated Yomini, but the point here all Clausewitz in theory that you can even find this, let's say, scientific approach to the story, but that's basically theoretical. It doesn't have a practical application at the end of the day, because the factors that intervene at all times are so overwhelming that if you stop thinking about the angle you put troops aside from certain basic deployment principles, you basically can't be defeated without even wondering why it happened, because literally everything can go wrong, and you have to take care theoretically of every single factor, not just of these geometrical ones that are evenly informing tactics at some level, but they're not the whole story, because if the geometrical principle was enough, we would basically even stop fighting, as you could even stop maneuvering, or having even a let's say you shouldn't take into consideration other things like quality or moral or experience or fatigue, or that would flatten down reality at the point that it's a crime, because the whole effort for war is trying to understand how complex it is, and what do? You narrow it down to what? To something that eventually will not correspond to, that basically goes into the other direction of what is actually needed in order to win. But we'll see that in more detail at one point. What is important here, the only, say, excuse that von Bülows seem to have had is this conception that is completely wrong, but whatever, that basically the larger or the closer the field, let's say and these two factors interact, sometimes also based on the distance at this point and the angle that we measured before, in an inversely proportional fashion, you can have this more punching effect on the enemy, meaning that if you assume that here we're talking about the same amount of forces, one thing is, but not even actually, because it doesn't even take into consideration the force that you're going to apply. But it's the idea that you fundamentally can envelop the enemy, and that the larger this angle is, and the more you can cover your own flanks, because this is partly what the point is, and hopefully you can even try to encircle the enemy, if this angle can even go beyond 180 degrees. But once again, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any single sense. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, this last is in fact unavoidable if we reflect that none of these substitutions could be made without violating truth and leaving out some of the things contained in the original conception, right? So this is important actually, and it tells you how sometimes the zeal for theoretical approaches, positive theoretical approaches, is easily dogmatic. At this point, not even irrational, but literally even illogical, right? That's where, especially the last principle of the angle brings you to. And von Clausewitz here is reflecting on the fact that there were some aspects instead in the original conception that were good. I mean, like trying to put together and try how the things like, in fact, the subsistence of the troops, the keeping them complete in numbers and equipment, the security of communications in their own country, the security of retreat in case it became necessary, are important aspects. Like they have to do with how you can keep an army together at one point. They exclude fundamentally how an army has to fight at that point, which is what the angle, like let's call it in this way, principle is trying to answer to in some ways, because it has to do partly also with the deployment of your own forces. but the right conception, and if von Clausewitz also develops eventually the same concepts, have to do what the interaction of these factors that is what the theory should concentrate upon, obviously having an enormous difficulty at one point, so that you would realize that even in there you can study these relations, but at the same time you also have to test how this thing is effectively carried out on the ground. You can't think it's simple theory of understanding how things work that are fundamentally going always to be different, also in size, in quantities, in intensity. So it's practically impossible even to reason in terms of, let's find the right formula here, whether this was the initial von Bulloff's intention or not. Von Clausewitz would have does take a completely different path on these issues. But those were good aspects to concentrate on. They did make a difference, and they do have some reason behind them. They do have, they're effectively emerging from real concerns of things that happen in warfare or by themselves. So von Clausewitz rightly points out that this progressive, jumps, let's say logical jumps that von Bulloff made, destroyed everything good that at the end of the day all those objects could entail, right, for the construction of a theory of the art of war. So and here it says that such substitutions that von Bulloff's made from the concept of base for all of those objects that we have seen, and then the one of extent on the one of base, and eventually the one of the angle formed by the army with its base and the to the extent, is a violation of the truth, right? It's more than that. It's more than a violation of the truth, in the sense that's what von Clausewitz is expressing it like. It's basically something that has nothing to do with logical connections, even more than real connections. Right? There is no point you would do something like that. It's as if you said that cars are numbers. Like, what does it even mean, frankly? That a car is a number. That's literally the same thing. We are at the same level, because you're bringing all matters, worries that has started well conceptually with the idea of even of the moral factors that can intervene in this, by flattening it down to a geometrical element like an angle. What's the point of the story? How does it even work? So von Clausewitz, probably writing this, was saying, what the hell? Yes, but and actually he says, by trying to say a bit what von Bulloff wrote, that the idea of a base is a real necessity for strategy, and to have conceived it is meritorious. So he recognizes that, but to make such a use of it as we have depicted is completely inadmissible, and could not but lead to partial conclusions which have forced these theorists into a direction opposed to common sense, namely to a belief in the decisive effect of the enveloping form of attack. So this is self-explanatory, but looking at it, let's reflect on the concept of base, because effectively the base of operation does require a great concern and understanding of all the objects that we have listed before, right? So there was something in strategic vision of von Bülow that had identified what also other thinkers actually had identified, that the position of the same army at one point that cannot be detached from the one of a base has to respond to certain of these concerns fundamentally, and securing certain aspects in this conduct of war. But here, the way von Bülow transformed it is completely inadmissible, as von Clausewitz writes, and leads to just partial conclusions. So here, von Clausewitz is trying maybe to say, okay, yes, it does make a difference, maybe that whether you respond to this, let's say, matters. I mean, but not even, I would say at this point, that there is a concept behind of this, behind the way it's even expressed, and the ridiculousness of how the whole thing is because it is utterly useless for real. But the whole thing, and von Clausewitz understands, was starting from the idea that, however, you can force the enemy to be enveloped, right, by your own forces, by saying, if your base is so near that you can't even close on the enemy at one point at this level of width on his wings, you can fundamentally crush. But it doesn't take any other factor into consideration. How can it work by the enemy itself? So von Clausewitz says that this thinking would lead, it's completely inadmissible. In order to be followed, it would have to lead to partial conclusions, which have forced these theorists into a direction opposed to common sense, because this is not even a matter of intelligence. This is saying, why would this thing would be developed in general? Like, what did you think by writing this at the end of the day? To do what? I mean, even yourself, do you think that really warfare could be narrowed down to this? And there were other people that were following this concept and saying, for what? So, in reference to the previous paragraphs that we have seen, probably von Clausewitz decided to insert this example to show us the relatively detached concepts, that how theory was still somewhat unnecessary, or partly just inapplicable, so that it couldn't make damage, because basically these principles could not really be applicated in warfare, right? Even if, let's say, these theorists had actually led an army in those circumstances, they would have been forced themselves to operate in a completely different fashion in comparison to these principles, right? But also to prove at this point, I believe, the inherent danger that at one point a positivistic elan can have in the formulation of certain ideas. Like von Bülow, for example, was fascinated with the French army. He even read other principles that were revolutionary. In fact, this is why he was distrusted so much, was arrested in this Ancien Regime states, because he read Rousseau. What the hell, man? You read Rousseau, and being part of an army that is fighting against the revolutionaries, well, there is something seriously wrong, and that's, in fact, von Bülow was in this sense a bit of a and this is important to remember, because there were also other thinkers like, for example, Lloyd, that had very different views, also from in this sense, and von Clausewitz and von Scharnhorst that at this point were studying these matters, they did realize what the French had been capable to do, but absolutely they weren't let's say pushed by the sense of finding a tactical solution that could be mathematically or geometrically accessible. Like here, I would go as far as saying that the French Revolution had sparked in some thinkers this idea that everything could be rationalized, right? You know, the French Revolution from the Enlightenment, etc., its intellectual roots was essentially criticizing the idea of let's say of subjectivism, of the idea that you can fundamentally believe something and acting upon it without it being rational. So today we know that human beings are no human being is not even half rational, right? And that we do act and live in ways that are fundamentally triggered by our instincts by large, and reason comes there to put a bit of order into the matter, but still pushes our intentions. The French Revolution, also as in other, utopistic contexts, produced let's say an absolutized and extremistic view of how an ideal society should be all about, in fact, a rational belief without any form of not truly of emotions by themselves, but let's say in this idea that everything had to be bent to certain principles that were based on order and on absolute lines, whether they were moral or even just, think about architecture, think about neoclassicism, this anxiety that there was to re-emulate the Roman Empire, the Greeks, and this idea of the theory of the harmonic proportions that had to be all one with the picture of politics and society as a reflection, right? So naturally the same French revolutionaries at one point, Republican France at this point if you prefer, had gone, had even won their own wars, because obviously they had started making their brain work, but not pretending that everything could be solved with these idealistic principles. But definitely in the heads of some theorists and some demagogues, that there was this perception now that everything could be reduced to pure mathematical principles, like also science and technology were like hinting at least in theoretical, like in pure theory, right, without forgetting about practice, which is another thing. And that's why obviously von Clausewitz and von Scharnhorst rejected these ideas, because knowledge is theory, but action is practice, right? So they do interfere between each other, but they still have a very different dimension on their own, right? So the general idea now was concentrating on this also subjective fact that obviously you arrive to at one point if you pretend that everything has to that such a complex theory can be reduced to, such a complex thing like warfare can be reduced to a very few things, because you will essentially fail to recognize the whole, and you will pick in turn some not objective but subjective points, and this were the belief in the decisive effect of the enveloping form of attack, right? That had its own, as we have seen before, had its own logic, given a certain the military history of the past decades, even in the Prussian military experience. But these are, let's say, principles that are somewhat desirable in some ways, but they can't always be performed, because you don't always have what you need in order to achieve them. That's what eventually von Clausewitz will say, so that not only that this may not happen at one point, but also that you would preferably do something else in order to win, rather than thinking about them at one point, right? If there are different conditions and different advantages to exploit, or simply certain necessities for which you can't do otherwise, which can also happen. So von Bülow's theory is, in this sense, a disgrace, and but it's a beautiful example because it shows you the overconfidence that you can have when you presume that you understand something, and you want to systematize it in a fashion that evidently highlights the same faults of this own theory, and that at that point, if you want to still sustain it, you have to go astray from common sense, as von Clausewitz rightly points out. The problem is that some people believe it as well. Some people don't understand how short they have fallen, essentially, in this attempt to reach the ultimate goal of having a functional theory of war, trying to not to expand on the complexity of war and on the let's say impossibility of a positivistic approach, but trying on the contrary to flat everything down, as if it was a war game for which, you know, the less the rules, the better it is, because at the end of the day, this is exactly what such conceptions try to do. It's this obsession for the ultimate principle, for the philosophical stone, like everything that solves every problem in one shot, for which you don't have to worry about anything else. But this is a very poor, limited, and mistaken approach on life and existence and physics and on the world. Like all we are constantly confronted by is such a difficult situation for which you can't see most of the times even what is going on, that you have to struggle into. You know, it's like a bit like what Churchill once said. You know, if you find yourself into hell, well, just keep going. You know, and that's literally it. Obviously, von Clausewitz tries to tell you what you can do practically to set yourself on a certain conditions that can, if not prevent failure, because that's impossible, at least to have more chances to foresee it and hopefully to counter it, right? So in a better way, let's say. So that's where it gets, right? And we could talk maybe even about the figure of von Bülow, but I don't think here it's really necessary. And I'm shocked myself at this point, you know, after having read von Clausewitz now for so long on this channel, having entered in the way he thinks it, listening to concepts like this is like saying, you know, what happens out there is really messed up sometimes, and people think. Just today I was thinking of something I heard yesterday, certain historical approaches, and sometimes von Clausewitz is right here in not even entering into the detail why things is wrong, or criticizing ad personam, or trying to crush or defeat someone, because sometimes it's enough just to expose that something doesn't even make sense, especially when it is against common sense, and then going on with your work, so proving not that other people are wrong, but that fundamentally that you are right, and that you can do that only on a rational base, and in a way that also presents itself positively towards who wants to learn, so that you don't create sects where you basically aggress or attack this or that thinker, trying to destroy every single thing that person says, but trying to be a bit simply realistic and concise and practical, and trying to dismiss what evidently doesn't look right, but on the base of evidence and of facts, especially when someone doesn't use evidence or facts to express his or her own beliefs. This is the real point, and that's why I think it's so important to read von Clausewitz, because it even gives you this model of behavior sometimes against problems that you can meet in everyday life, and that you really don't know how to react like. I would like to make in the future some of videos on, for example, how to respond to criticism, or how to get into a say a debate, a discussion, and making sound points, and making your best essentially with what you have, and trying to stay in fact objective, open, rational, anti-dogmatic. Like, in a way, you can't really do a service to yourself even before then to trying to, let's say, doing for someone else. In fact, I do believe also personally that the best way you can help the others is helping yourself, because if you don't help yourself, you just set yourself a certain basis for which, say, okay, well, now from now on I will just do this to help others, but not even understanding why you're doing. Well, you can have great difficulties, and instead probably the best service that you can render to someone is to show that person what has to do in order for that person to do it by himself. That's probably the most important part of the story. Not trying to impose something on others, not trying to order others to do what you think they should do for others, but simply doing the best you can do for yourself, and being an example and facilitating life, right, to people, because fundamentally you are not doing it if you're just intervening, like saying, okay, well, I presume things are in a certain way and all the others have to follow. These theorists were trying to find an actually working principle that by definition does not work, or by definition, by simple glance to it, it's really devoid of any common sense, of rational approach. So it's very important, in my opinion, to just stop for once to reflect, and being honest, first of all, with yourself. Be sincere with yourself. I mean, you can even lie to other people sometimes. It depends. It's not always wrong, but you can't lie to yourself. You can't go out there pretending to tell something without posing yourself a question whether it's the right thing. And all it happens today, it seems that this is what is going on, and everybody comes up with a thinking that they have not even thought thoroughly through, and simply pretending that it has to work. And it's a form of narcissism or exhibitionism by pretending, but it's stupid, because I believe that such attitudes are in fact directly proportional to stupidity, but they reveal lack of understanding, right? So lack of theory and lack of practice. So even never trust a theory that doesn't have a practical side to it. Like, be always distrustful of who tries to present you a system that is essentially a different view of the world without asking yourself what this serves to exactly, right? Which obviously is something you can do with everything you're presented with, because and that should be the right attitude, like trying to test that, not to be skeptical, right? You don't have to be skepticist just for the sake of it, like everybody's wrong, they don't know what they're saying, because that's also silly. Because most of the times it's not a matter of absolute knowledge, it's a matter of relative knowledge. You can't grow if you don't accept that you can learn from others, because nobody is born taught, let's say. You have to struggle for arriving to certain understanding, and the only way you can do that, the easiest way you can do it, is learning it from others. But learning entails that you have to be able to make a proper use of that theory, right? It can be even just a theoretical exercise if you want, but still you're gonna expand your mind in the process, and it's gonna be fine. And okay, we could go on this because there are so many examples, or in fact real applications of this thought that you can test on yourself, but we can all relate to it, I believe, in a way or another in our life. So it's fairly easy to see how consistent this predisposition can be for a real achievement. I mean, for really making things work. Here I stop because I don't know even what I'm talking about anymore. I made this video today having actual problems in understanding it, because I couldn't think that the theory here was so simple. In fact, I still have some doubts whether this general conception is, and the same from Clausewitz, after all, explains why such ideas were fundamentally developed. It was an over-reliance on this enveloping tendency that does make a sense in that historical context. I mean, that's a moment where much of the debate had started from this takes. So never underestimate that this is not a pure. This also comes from something, but it's simply wrong at the same time. So you don't have to excuse it just because it's part of its times. That there are wrong ideas at every time that perfectly fit motivationally. I mean, for motives to the context, but that are still wrong, right? Anyhow, okay, let's stop it here for now. Next paragraph is going to be very short. It's on internal lines, right? And this is partly the same criticism that we have made on this paragraph, but a little bit different. Von Clausewitz just hints at the wall, what the wall problem is, and maybe we will expand it on it a little bit more. Besides what von Clausewitz says, talk about a bit about Yomini, etc. But for now, let's stop it here for this paragraph, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.